Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Peart, and welcome to the Salt-Tea Science Podcast. And welcome to our very first Salt-Tea Science Myths and Legends episode. So you may be asking, why are we having a Myths and Legends episode on a science podcast? Good question. And the answer to that question is, there are several reasons. First, next week is our very first listeners episode, and I want to give you plenty of time to submit your answers, which are due tomorrow, Saturday, October 26th, 2019, at the stroke of midnight. And second, which is probably the biggest reason, you can't talk about the ocean without taking into consideration the accounts and tales of our seafaring forefathers and mothers for hundreds and even thousands of years before what we would call the era of modern science. People from all over the world were exploring the ocean either for food or exploration. And while at sea, they often saw strange and unusual creatures and occurrences that they just couldn't explain. And so they did the best job that they could at explaining what they saw in terms that they understood at the time. And so this is often how these nautical myths and legends developed, which then we enjoy in movies, books, and even cartoons today. And so when it comes to nautical legends, when we take a deeper dive into the story, especially with the scientific approach, we can often see some exciting truths behind the story. And finally, nautical myths and legends are just fun, and they've played a huge role in history, so why not? Okay, and with that said, I'll now introduce us to our very first myths and legends topic, which is that infamously daunting and foreboding ghost ship, the Flying Dutchman. Okay, so the Flying Dutchman is a rather young legend in the scope of anthropogenic history. It originated somewhere in the 1600s, but this legend still has an impact on today's modern culture, as seen in movies like The Pirates of the Caribbean, starring Johnny Depp as the infamous Captain Jack Sparrow, and even in cartoons like SpongeBob SquarePants, the Flying Dutchman has made several appearances. So one of my first questions is, what is the Flying Dutchman legend? And to answer that question, I have a very special guest on the line, the infamous fanfic writer and deviant art artist, Rebecca Seibert. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Hello, Salty Science listeners.
So Rebecca, I know that you're always doing research for your various stories that you write as well as for your artwork. And when I was talking to you a couple weeks ago and I was mentioning that I was going to do a special Myths and Legends episode on the Flying Dutchman, you said you had come across a bit of the legend in some of your research.
Yes, that's correct.
So Rebecca, I was wondering if you would be willing to share with our listeners the story of the Flying Dutchman with us.
Of course. Alright, so here's the story of the Flying Dutchman. Now bear in mind there are different versions, but the bare bones version is that the Flying Dutchman is a ghost ship which can never make port. Seeing it is considered a bad omen which will result in death or other misfortune. The more, shall we say, general consensus of the legend's origins is that the captain of the Flying Dutchman came from Holland, and he had been trying to sail around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa during a storm. His crew begged him to make port, but he refused. Now, some versions say in doing so, he deliberately blasphemed against God, or that he had already made a pact with the devil to be the fastest sailing captain. Regardless, the Dutch captain pressed on through the storm, and there were no survivors. But of course, in the immortal words of Captain Jack Sparrow, then where do the stories come from, I wonder? In any case, as the captain refused to make port during the storm, his eternal ironic punishment is that he and his crew can never see land again. And that's the end of the story. Though an interesting fact is, we still don't know exactly how the story originated. We mostly know about the Flying Dutchman from secondary writing in the 1700s. For example, the people who wrote about the Flying Dutchman never saw it firsthand. They only wrote down what other people saw. However, allegedly, Prince George, who later became King George V, had spotted the ship in 1881 when he and his older brother, Prince Albert Victor, had sailed near Australia. The helmsman who had spotted the ship had a fatal accident, and that seemed to reaffirm the legendary bad luck of the Flying Dutchman.
Well, I guess we can't argue with royalty, can we?
No, we cannot.
That's to be debated. But anyway, well, that was great, Rebecca. Thank you so much for sharing the story and some of your research with us.
No problem. Anytime.
Okay, so that was the legend of the Flying Dutchman. Now let's get into some of the science behind it. And I chose the Flying Dutchman as our first Myths and Legend episode because it involves some really cool science in the realm of oceanography, physics, and optics. So my first question is, can a ship or a boat like the Flying Dutchman really fly? Well, with today's modern technology, maybe. But with the technology of the 17th and 18th century, it's not likely. But can we perceive a ship to be flying out at sea? Well, the answer to that question is a definite yes. The image of a strange and ghostly flying ship, as portrayed in the tale of the Flying Dutchman, all comes down to optical illusions, but on a very grand scale. And the image of a floating or flying ship is basically a mirage. And so here's a quick example. Have you ever driven or ridden in a car and you look down the road ahead of you and it looks like you're about to drive into a puddle, but as you get closer and closer to where you thought the puddle was going to be, you realize that the puddle isn't there, but further down the road. And then the next thing you know, you've driven the entire length of the road and you never came across a puddle. And that's because the puddle was a mirage. And so what is a mirage? A mirage is basically an optical illusion due to different air temperatures and densities. In the case of the puddle on the road, the ground is hot and heats up the air right above it, making it less dense. But the air right above that heated air is cooler and therefore denser. Now, normally sunlight travels in a straight line through the atmosphere to our eyes, giving us sight, but light travels slightly at different speeds through hot and cold air. The sunlight travels through the atmosphere, first entering the colder, dense air above, but then as it enters the warmer and less dense air, it's refracted or bent, and the bent is almost like a U shape, but our eyes don't perceive that the light is bent. As a matter of fact, our brains think the light is still traveling in a straight line, and therefore the mirage image is formed. And in the case of the puddle on the road, it's actually an image of the clouds and the sky, just coming from the ground. And so when it comes to the Flying Dutchman, the image of a flying ship is also a mirage, but it's a special kind of mirage called a fata morgana. And a fata morgana is formed slightly different than a typical mirage. In the case of a fata morgana, instead of having warm air on the bottom and cold air on top, you actually have a layer of warm air on the top and a cold, denser layer of air on the bottom, which often occurs in colder and polar regions, which then makes sense why the Flying Dutchman is often seen off the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Okay, and when you're out at sea, a fata morgana mirage of a ship can take on many different forms and even give it a little ghostly appearance, because a fata morgana mirage or image often changes rapidly and can make a ship look stretched and distorted, as well as make it look as if it's floating inside the waves. And then a fata morgana mirage can even make a ship look like it has another ship sailing right above it, but inverted or upside down. And finally, which is more than likely the case of the Flying Dutchman, if you're on one boat and there's another boat way off in the distance at a point where it's just below the horizon line so you can't see it, a fata morgana mirage can cause the image of the real ship to be elevated and appear to be floating, which would make sense why sailors thought they were seeing the Flying Dutchman. And here's another little tidbit of knowledge. There is some evidence that fata morganas can also occur at night, so sorry to disappoint you, King George. And don't worry, listeners, I'll be posting images and diagrams on the Salty Science Weebly page, as well as a really cool video link of a flying sailboat that someone caught on camera. Okay, and now it's time for our 1-minute summary. In this episode, Rebecca called in and shared the daunting tale of the ghostly ship, the Flying Dutchman. And the Flying Dutchman, having originated from Holland, had a captain who was thought to have made a pact with the devil because his ship was one of the fastest ships at the time. However, on one of its voyages, a huge storm developed while she was sailing around the Cape of Good Hope. The crew begged the captain to make port, but he refused. And while the crew and ship all perished, they were forever cursed to sail the 7 seas without any hope of ever making it back to port. And while we enjoyed the tale of the Flying Dutchman, we then also looked into some of the really cool science behind this legend and discovered that what the sailors thought was the ghostly ship could have actually been a real ship off in the distance. But due to superior mirages like the Fata Morganas, the ship would appear flying or even distorted, which would attribute to its ghostly appearance and thus perpetuate the legend of the Flying Dutchman. And that's the end of our 1-minute summary. Okay, so now for our big question. Why do we care? Well, in the case of the Flying Dutchman, it's a tale that is part of nautical and seafaring history, and in our pursuit in understanding the science of the ocean by exploring some of the history and accounts of sailors and watermen and women, it adds a richness to our understanding of the ocean. And in the particular case of the legend of the Flying Dutchman, we've learned that when you're out at sea, sometimes things aren't always as they appear. So it's good to have a foundational knowledge to help you explain some of the strange and unusual things that you might see. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed our very first Myths and Legend episode on the Flying Dutchman. I just want to give another big thank you to Rebecca for sharing the legend of the Flying Dutchman with us. And listeners, if you want to read some of Rebecca's amazing fanfic stories, you can find her under the name ZabbyQ. And if you want to check out some of her amazing artwork, you can go to DeviantArt and look her up as Bunny Joyce. And FYI listeners, I'll be doing a Myths and Legends episode once a quarter, right before each listener's episode. So stay tuned. Okay, so next week is our very first listener's episode. Are you excited? I am excited. And if you haven't submitted your answers, thoughts, and perspectives, you have until tomorrow at the stroke of midnight to submit them to me at saltysciencepodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so that's it for now. Until next week, don't forget to help keep our oceans clean and to always stay salty. Thank you for listening to Salt-Tea Science. But guess what? You don't have to let the fun end here. Go to www.saltysciencepodcast.weebly.com, where I've posted some cool videos, my study notes, and some really neat experiments that you can try at home. And if you want to follow along with my own research, you can follow me on Instagram. User handle Teps Adventure. That's TEPS Adventure. All Salt-Tea Science episodes are available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, and YouTube, plus a number of other podcasting apps. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes, as this is the best way to spread the word about this podcast. Salt-Tea Science is listener supported, so if you would like to show your support, visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/Salt-Tea Science, where you can either make a one-time donation of any amount or join the Salt-Tea Science crew for as little as $1 a month. So visit the Salt-Tea Science Patreon and sign up today.